Welcome to the West Virginia Legislature on the West Virginia Channel. I'm Beth Voorhees. Today at 1 o'clock, a meeting of the Senate Select Committee on Tax Reform. The committee members are Senator Carnes, Chair, Senator Blair, Vice Chair, Senator Boso, Senator Ferns, and Senator Gaunch are the Republican members of this committee. Senator Jeffries and Senator Plymel are the Democratic members of this committee. At issue is Senate Bill 335. The purpose of the bill is to repeal the consumer sales and service tax, the use tax, and the personal income tax, to enact the general consumption tax and the temporary single-rate income tax law, and to phase out and repeal the corporate net income tax. This bill was just introduced yesterday. Today, before the Senate Select Committee on Tax Reform, two presentations about this from Ted Boettner, Executive Director of the West Virginia Center on Budget and Policy, and John Deskins, Director of the Bureau of Business and Economic Research and Associate Professor at the West Virginia University College of Business and Economics. They will speak on this notion of restructuring West Virginia's taxes. It is taking place in the Senate Finance Committee. They have yet to activate their cameras, so please stand by as we wait for the Select Committee on Tax Reform to begin its meeting. We're waiting for a meeting of the Senate Select Committee on Tax Reform. The Finance Committee has yet to activate its cameras. We'll join it as soon as Senator Carnes will join the committee as soon as Senator Carnes convenes the committee, as soon as he calls it to order. Please stand by. We hope to bring you this important meeting of the Senate Select Committee on Tax Reform. Again, we're waiting for the Senate Select Committee on Tax Reform. One of my colleagues, David Beard from the Morgantown Dominion Post, just tweeted from the committee room, Tax Reform Committee hasn't appeared for its 1 p.m. Presenters and audience cooling heels. Also, my colleague Ashton Mara tells me Republicans were caucusing earlier and perhaps that ran over. So we'll wait here for the Senate Select Committee on Tax Reform, hearing a presentation regarding the elimination of the personal income tax and enacting a general consumption tax. A presentation from Ted Bettner, the Executive Director of the West Virginia Center on Budget and Policy, and John Deskins, Director of the Bureau of Business and Economic Research and Associate Professor at the West Virginia University College of Business and Economics. We will join this meeting as soon as Senator Carnes, the chair of the Senate Select Committee on Tax Reform, calls the meeting to order and the cameras are activated.
I'd like to welcome everyone to the meeting of the Select Committee on Tax Reform. I apologize for the late start. We were tied up downstairs in a meeting with the governor and ran into our schedule here just a little bit, but we're going to go ahead and get started. And I will call on the senator from Ohio for a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move approval of the minutes from the previous meeting.
The question is on approval of the minutes from the previous meeting. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Reckon the minutes have been approved. We have a couple of folks we're going to hear from today. I'm going to note before we quite get to that we're not actually looking at a bill today, but I think most people, and I know our speakers, are aware that a bill has been filed. I believe most of the members of the audience are aware of that bill. And so I imagine a lot of what we're going to hear today is in relation to that bill. We'll probably actually begin discussion formally on that bill at our next meeting. But today we're going to hear some viewpoints as it relates to the kinds of things we're looking at. So the first person that we have presenting today is Ted Bettner, who is the Executive Director of the West Virginia Center on Budget and Policy. And if Mr. Bettner would like to come forward. And if you could state your name when you have a moment there.
And, yeah, sure. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the committee for having me. I really appreciate it. It's an honor to be here and to be with you today. My name is Ted Bettner. I'm the Executive Director of the West Virginia Center on Budget and Policy. We're a nonpartisan policy research institute that's been around for almost 10 years this December. We work on tax and budget issues, family economic security, and economic development. Today I was asked to talk a little bit about tax reform and about replacing the personal income tax, the corporate income tax, and the sales tax with a general consumption tax as outlined in Senate Bill 335. Just to begin, I'm going to try to have a presentation, but the first question we like to ask from our point of view is who pays? And one thing that we like to do is look at our incidents in West Virginia and look at who pays state and local taxes. And if you look at this chart, you'll see that West Virginia has an upside down tax system, just pretty close to most states. There's several that don't, but low and moderate income families, especially in the middle, pay about 9% of their income in state and local taxes, while the top 1% pays about 6.5%. So that's the opposite of the federal tax system, which is the opposite. Low and moderate income people, some pay nothing. You guys are pretty familiar with the famous 47%. That's mostly because of the EITC and other measures. But on the state level, state and local taxes are overall regressive, and they are in West Virginia. And that's mostly because of our sales tax. The personal income tax in West Virginia is the only tax that's based on the ability to pay. So when we break it down by income group, we can see in West Virginia, when we look at the sales tax, if you're in that top 1%, you're paying about 1% of your income in state and local sales tax in West Virginia. And if you're in that bottom 20%, you're paying about 6.4% of your family income in state and local sales taxes. As the personal income tax is the opposite. Top 1% pays about 4.9% of their family income in the personal income tax, while the bottom 20% pays less than 1%. So that's sort of a brief overview of sort of the incidents. A couple states do incidence analysis. We don't. They've been done in the past. That's something you could request too, for the state to do that as well. Initially, what I was asked to do too is look at the Senate Bill 335. I only had a little less than 24 hours to look at it. It's a big bill. And I had just a couple questions, a couple different thoughts about it. So far, there's no fiscal note. So in terms of our analysis, to be able to look at it, we need to be able to have a fiscal note to understand if it's revenue neutral. Another thought that we had when I looked at the bill, implementation of this tax probably could not occur in 3 to 4 months. I would say if you're going to do something like this, definitely give it a little bit more time, because it'll take a long time for this. Not a long time, probably at least 6 months to a year. You might want to talk to the tax department whether that can be implemented. So that was one of the big thoughts. And probably the biggest critique I have of the bill is that it's highly regressive and would further exacerbate growing income inequality in the state. And also reduce consumer spending, which would hurt our state's economy, in our opinion. And when you look at real-world research and academic evidence, which John hopefully can touch on too, shows that cutting the income tax is not a surefire way to boost economic growth. There is no academic consensus that replacing the income taxes with a sales tax boosts economic growth. You'll find some economists that say, yeah, that's a good thing. You find a lot more in the middle, and some that say it's a really bad thing. I just want to be very clear that there's no consensus among academics that it works. And most states that have cut their income tax since 2012 are underperforming compared to the national average. So it's our neighbor, Ohio. We also want to look at Kansas as a really good example. Several states have done that, and the only state that's doing a little bit better than average is North Carolina. But when you look closely at North Carolina, most of the growth is happening in the urban areas of Charlotte and Raleigh. And if you look even closer to North Carolina, you see that Georgia and South Carolina are performing even better. And those states both have income taxes. Actually, South Carolina has a higher income tax than we do. Other parts of the bill, one thing to consider too is that when we talked about Kansas and what has happened there, that's really a really good example of what can happen in a state that looks to go to a march to zero, which is they're headed to a march to zero to have that income tax to be zero. It's important to note that a bill passed out of the House yesterday to roll back all of Governor Brownback's tax cuts. This was a strong bipartisan bill in Kansas's legislature to do that, so that's really important to consider. Another thing too is no state has ever abolished their income tax other than Alaska. And guess what Alaska is trying to do right now? Lawmakers with bipartisan support and the governor of Alaska are trying to restore their income tax. Their severance tax went from $5 billion to zero. That's because they allow deductions on the costs of before the tax is computed. We don't do that in West Virginia. We have just a gross receipts tax. But those are both pretty good cautionary tales. Another thing to think about when you're talking about higher sales taxes is that could hurt in-state businesses, that they'll shift their purchases to neighboring states or the internet. Also, levying business-to-business sales taxes could hurt vertical integration. So you'll have firms that go out to a small accounting firm, they'll stop doing that. They'll start doing it internally to avoid the tax. That's one thing to be pretty concerned about. Another thing to be concerned about too, in West Virginia, a lot of people, if you look at the Ernst & Young analysis, which I know they were here from COST, I think they appeared here last year to the Tax Reform Committee, you'll see that businesses in West Virginia paid about $500 million in sales taxes, and they paid about $400 million in corporate income and individual income taxes. So if you're talking about growing that sales tax, most likely you're talking about increasing taxes on businesses, especially if you're getting into inputs and you're getting into professional services and things like that. So that's really important to consider. Another thing with the bill, if it was implemented, West Virginia would have the highest statewide grocery tax in the nation. The only border state that has a grocery tax is Virginia at 2%. There is a county in Alabama that the grocery tax, I was doing research last night, it's 10%. So, but statewide, West Virginia would have the highest grocery tax. And a lot of these things are just questions. Like I said, I just got the bill. I've had it less than 24 hours, so I've been trying to read over it. A couple of the big questions I had when I was looking at it was, one was new home purchases. Maybe somebody could talk about that, whether that would be covered, because that could be a major expense if you have to pay a sales tax on a new home. Other was private university tuition. Is that something that's exempted from this? I noticed a bunch of activities, but I didn't notice whether the tuition itself was exempted. Other things, the federal deduction, that's another big point. It's difficult for some people to add up their sales taxes at the end of the year and then deduct those on their federal income tax. It's a lot of receipts. Also, there's a question I had when I first read the bill, is like what happens to local sales taxes if we abolish the sales news tax and the state's the one collecting all of those, what would happen there? Those are some things you might want to consider as well. But that's overall the overview. I've provided you with analysis too, going into depth about some of the things I've been talking about as well. In our view, when we look at the income tax, we think it's a critical component to the state's tax system. It's good to have a very balanced tax system. If you get over-reliant on one tax, especially one like the sales tax, which is not as sustainable as the income tax. Sales tax tends to grow slower over time than the income tax does. So that's one reason to sort of worry about it. For our consideration, when we look at the income tax, it hasn't been modernized since 1987. Middle income people are going all into the brackets since they haven't changed since '87. We would look at the exemption of $2,000 it's either for somebody like me or somebody that's a billionaire gets the same exemption. Might want to look at phasing that out. That'd bring in about $10 million. Also, an earned income tax credit. 26 states have a state EITC. That's about 18 of those are refundable. That's another thing that the state could look at when we're looking at reforming our income tax system. Because the main thing we want to do, one thing you can do with taxes that is nice, you can incentivize certain behavior, especially at the low income level, because when we're looking at high income people, just to give you an idea on this chart, let's see. When we're looking at high income people, we look at people that make over $200,000 or more, they only spend about 51% of their income in a year. When we look at low income people, some very low income people spend way more than they make in a year due to transfers, borrowing, and other things. So you're pretty much exempting a big part of that income on top. But most importantly, when you look at this bill, the Group Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, which has a micro-simulation model that is very widely respected. It's actually used by our tax department quite frequently, presentations. They ran the analysis of taking this new general consumption tax and assuming that it's revenue neutral, which I'm not sure about. And if you eliminate the personal income, the corporate income tax, and the sales and use tax, this is what it looks like. It's a tax increase for about 80% of the households in the state. So if you're making on average $40,000 a year, under this bill, you would see a tax increase of about $1,071. Now, if you're in the top 1%, if you're making $778,000 on average, you're going to see a tax cut of $27,755. So this would exacerbate our upside down tax system. Like I said, most states have that. Ours is a little better than others now, but this would probably put us in the top 5 in terms of regressivity. So that's a very important thing to keep in mind when we're looking at tax changes, is that incidence. Who's going to pay for those changes? I'm happy to take any questions or that anybody has or any detail on anything that's been presented.
Thank you, Ted.
Yep.
Do we have anyone who'd like to ask any questions of our presenter? Senator from Nicholas County.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ted, good to see you again.
Good to see you
Glad
too,
you're
Senator.
here. On a day like today, I'm
No,
surprised you're not out
actually,
running.
I want to go run after
I
this.
was going to say, you got a run schedule, I'm sure. When I look through the chart that you have, new general consumption tax, revenue neutral, the diagram that you've got up on the screen, you would agree with me that the people in the category that are shown in the blue are traditionally your people that are your entrepreneurs who are doing philanthropic investment for purposes of stimulating, growth and opportunities. These are also your entrepreneurs who are making substantial investments that re-employ people who are struggling to find a job. Isn't that the case?
Well, I don't have the analysis for West Virginia, but a lot of small businesses, believe it or not, don't have much of an income, especially the small ones. And this bill would particularly hit those small businesses. But when we're looking at higher income people, that graph I showed earlier, they tend to hold on to more of their money and income and savings. Businesses tend to react a hell of a lot more to demand for their goods and services. So incentivizing, getting more money out into the economy, growing the middle class are some ways that I would say to help those businesses the most. And when we look at entrepreneurs throughout history, like Bill Gates, a lot of these people come from the middle class. So that's really important to consider. But when we're looking at businesses that are, giving them a little bit more money, you have to, if you look at it, state and local taxes in West Virginia, state and local business taxes are less than 3% of the cost of doing business. So when you look at labor costs, when you look at goods, when you're buying capital for your business, those are much higher costs. Energy costs, if you're a manufacturing firm, those costs are way much higher than your state and local taxes. And it's also important to remember, too, that these are deductible. So it depends on the federal level what happens with tax changes, but you're sending about a 35% on that top corporate income tax rate. You're sending that back to the federal government. But there's no doubt, I mean, there's definitely businesses at the top that have a lot of money, but I would say the key determinant to get businesses to invest is demand. And that's people that are wanting to purchase their project and do those things. And if you want to get them to hire people, it better be a lot more money. Just to give you an example, we cut the business franchise tax, we phased it out, and we cut the corporate net income from 9 to 6.5%. Altogether, that's about $250 million. We have about 40,000, depends on the year, 40 to 45,000 businesses in West Virginia. So if you pull that out across all the businesses, the average tax cut's in your $6,000 to $7,000 range. And if I give you $6,000 or $7,000, the question is for the business, what am I going to do with that? It's hard to hire someone with $6,000. You could invest it into your business by purchasing things. That's one way. But it's very difficult to hire somebody with something so small. And that comes back to the issue, too, that taxes are just one thing that businesses look at. The number one thing that businesses look at is a well-skilled workforce. So anything that we can do, and I would argue that I think there's pretty good consensus that West Virginia's main economic impediment is that we have a very unhealthy, often drug-addicted workforce, and that we have to do something about that. And this wouldn't do anything to really address that issue.
Okay, and finally, looking at the numbers, you know, and one of the things in looking at this particular program that we've ran out with this particular bill with 335 is that, you know, we have a tendency to encourage people to spend in our society today. There's not a lot of encouragement to save. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think we've promoted that since we've been an organization. Only about half the people in the state have access to a retirement account. Unfortunately, at the federal level, that's being taken away. That states won't have the ability to do that, but absolutely, saving is very important. But the macroeconomic impact in West Virginia versus saving versus spending is much more, you have much more time getting growth in the economy if people are spending it here. But if they're saving and it goes into a tax-deferred account, it's not really in West Virginia too much. But if people are saving and putting it into a bank account, that's not working, it's not getting spent. One of the problems we had during the recession, too, is that a lot of businesses were sitting on very, very large sums of money, trillions of dollars. And the problem was they weren't investing that because of uncertainty, all these other issues. So unleashing that capital and getting that into the economy should be one of our biggest concerns. But we want people to save, but we want those companies to take that money and invest it. And so how do we incentivize that to happen, you know, is one part of the puzzle. Absolutely.
Okay, thanks.
Senator?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ted, thanks for being here. You referenced Kansas a couple of times, you know, and I think maybe I've heard you talk about it before. What you didn't talk about in here is what really happened in Kansas. I'm assuming, being this is what you do in your day job, you know, yeah, the actual political ramifications of what happened there. Do you not?
Yeah, there's 2 slides. If you let me point you guys down to the slides, and we can look at what happened in terms of. So on the note on slide 11, talks about that. They did personal income tax cuts. You can look at their brackets there. They had 3 with a top rate of 6.45%. Ours is 6.5. And then they lowered those brackets, as you can see below, and lowered the tax rates. They also got rid of passive business income from their income tax. According to cost, that's about $200 million in West Virginia. They also, after that, they raised the sales tax and they increased the cigarette tax.
I'm not talking specifically about what the end result was, but how they got to that end result. You understand what happened in the political process, that there was actually one bill that was introduced that ultimately got split up, and the part that had revenue enhancements in it did not get passed. You're aware of that, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not aware of that exact point. I know the governor signed the bill and was very supportive of the bill when it passed. Governor Brown.
You're not aware that the original bill introduced included 2 different portions that had cuts and increases, and that bill was split apart? You're not aware of that?
All I did was look at the actual bill that passed and what was implemented. I don't know enough about Kansas politics. I wasn't following all the legislation there, but I did follow.
I just thought in your job and what you do that was something you might have looked at. I mean, I'm not an economist, and I don't know if you are, but even I'm
I'm a
aware.
policy analyst, yeah.
Okay, even I'm aware of what actually happened. I just think it's a little bit misleading to talk about the bill that was passed without touching on how they got to that point, and then use them regularly as an example of what not to do.
Yeah, I mean, we use it because the governor was very supportive of it. He said it would be a shot of adrenaline into the state's economy. It passed. He could have vetoed it. I mean, he could have,
Well, I just
It is
thought I would
what it
share
is.
with everybody listening in so they know the backstory.
Yeah, that's important.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. The senator from Wayne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ted, actually, let's go to a little bit more of the backstory, the real history in Kansas. When Senator Morris was the Senate president and got ousted, that's when they went to the major change in terms of that. Their unfunded, their deficit in their coffers from the state was unbelievable. Knowing Senator Morris quite well, because he was NCSL chair president then, he related to me all the things that were going on. So I think in defense of what you're presenting there, the backstory is the few years before that happened that caused them to be in so much of a deficit from some of the cuts that they made. So I think that when we're talking about telling the rest of the story, let's go back when we go into Kansas that led them into the critical situation they were in from a budget standpoint, that they actually had to look at everything that they were doing. And it's very similar to what could happen in West Virginia. And I think that's the similarity that you're trying to bring, is if you go back to when Senator Morris was the Senate president, they had a very stable budget. They were, Kansas was looked at, and I had many friends in Kansas that senators and such that I served on the NCSL with, and I recalled and talked to them quite a bit. So, let's do a little bit more on that and go back to what led Kansas into the situation that they did what they've done, because that's pretty important as well.
Yeah, they had surpluses before the tax cuts too.
Yeah.
It's very important to understand that.
Thank you.
Are there any other members? If not, I do have a couple of questions myself. You'd raised some questions that I think are important questions, and in some cases maybe could be clarified a little bit for me. If we go back to your example related to, for example, North Carolina and South Carolina, you said that South Carolina is outgrowing North Carolina, I think. And what I'd wonder is what type of a time frame, because I think it's very important to understand that in any given year, anybody can outgrow anybody.
That's absolutely.
And that it only works if we track this over a longer period of time. Do you know what the time frame is?
Yeah, what I did was look at when North Carolina, in this chart here, I looked at private sector job growth in North Carolina when the tax cuts took effect. That gives us somewhat of a real live experiment to say, okay, North Carolina, the moment that those tax rates went into effect, let's see how you did versus your peer states. And this was the result. I think I pulled this up from BLS. But one thing you brought up is absolutely correct. The time period you check. So when you look at these academic studies that are done constantly, you'll find that if they just move the time period 5 places to the right or 10 places over here, the results disappear. And that's what happened to a very famous study that was done by Robert Reed, that was redone by Bill Gale and some others at Tax Policy Institute. All they did was redo the study and move those things a couple years, and bam. But the reason for this chart was just to show exactly, point to point, when the tax cuts took effect, how are they doing. I am not making an argument that the tax cuts or the higher income tax in South Carolina have done anything to help in this situation. Like I said earlier, taxes are a small cost to the share of doing business.
The reason I asked that, neither one of those states are in the situation of being able to say they don't have an income tax. One is a higher tax state, one's a lower tax state. But when I looked at those numbers, what I actually saw was that in the 25-year period previous to roughly now, 1990 to 2015, North Carolina considerably outgrew South Carolina. So I just kind of wondered, so a long span there of 25 years, North Carolina has a much greater growth rate than South Carolina. And I assume we're not trying to plan, when we make discussion of such a major shift in our tax structure, we're not hoping necessarily for what happens over just the next 2 years, but we're trying to plan for the next 30 years. And I think sometimes we've got to make sure we're getting a big span there. You also mentioned the idea that if we go with a sales tax as opposed to the income tax related to the deductibility on your federal tax return, that folks would have to have big piles of receipts, and yet
it's just a little bit more difficult. That's all.
Well, my understanding is the IRS actually provides essentially guidance tables or safe harbor tables, and you don't have to save any receipts. You can simply go down and select how much money you make and pick that deduction off of the chart, and that there's no real need to collect a bunch of receipts, is there?
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem will be, will a lot of people do that? Is one question too, and who?
Well, certainly when they get money back, I assume they will.
If you're deducting,
if you're going to get money back as a result of checking one little chart and finding out, I would assume most people. I would certainly do that, and I'm sure that you would do the same. Do you know what the average EITC is? In the states that have a state of EITC in terms of the maximum?
I want to say Minnesota has one of the highest, and around 40 or so %, 45. I'm not
40 or 40.
I don't have that detailed information in front of me. It's a range, I think, anywhere from 3 up to 40 or %.
So they're really all over the map, and we don't really. Again, it's kind of hard to tell what the effect of such a thing might be.
Hey, got it. Awesome. Well, it looks like California is 80% on a very small segment of that population. There's Minnesota, I was kind of right. But if you don't have an income tax, it's very hard to have a state or income tax credit unless you just do it. Washington State actually has what's called a working families tax credit that they implemented. So you could
theoretically you can do an EITC. Well, that's interesting.
You have to fund it, and you can fund it through TANF back to most of these states that have EITCs.
I've heard that.
Instead of cash assistance, which is going to about the same population. That's one way that 18 of the states that have refundable credits fund it. So you can fund it that way, and you'll see in your budget, of course, that you have a block grant that you spend down, that maintenance of effort. You could just say, hey, that's EITC. I think one committee talked about breaking down where we spend our TANF funds, which
I recall some of this discussion during the tax committee, and that's a very interesting point in that the state of West Virginia, even eliminating the income tax, as we see with the example of Washington, could still implement what would function like an EITC, and we would be able to use federal money to do it.
Yeah, some of it. You could, if you have a refundable, so theoretically, I believe, I'm not 100%, need to look at it a little bit more, but theoretically, the whole thing would be refundable, right? Because you would just take a percentage of whatever it is, like 10%. So there would be, the whole thing should be refundable.
Sure. Now, another question that I have, and I know this is a concern, you brought it up, but it's a concern that's very much out there, and I've heard very much out there, is the idea that going from 6% to 8% would hurt the poor. An EITC would essentially effectively counteract that effect, wouldn't it, if we implemented such a thing?
Yeah, the beauty would also help incentivize a lot of those people. Those are people that are all working, it's earned income, and also it would help people incentivize them to get into the labor force, because a lot of those people are working at low-wage jobs. That's why they don't make very much. So in these small towns in West Virginia, this is a way to put money back into the economy as well. They spend it pretty immediately.
So long term, because what we've got is a bill, but then we do what we call a perfecting process through.
That would help with the
if in terms of your perspective, an EITC would take a huge amount of the edge off of this bill as it is.
It would take some, we'll have to run the numbers.
And now another question I have for you. Do you know if I had a family of 4, which I don't, it's been a long time since I knew what that was like, because I got a family of 10.
I've got a family of 4.
I've got a family of 10, and that's, a family of 4 making $30,000 a year in West Virginia, what percentage of their income do they pay in income tax as an overall net? Do you have a notion of what that is?
Yeah, it's in that chart. I don't think it's broken out incredibly well. If you look at that second line, I'll have to get back to you on that to get that exact figure.
If I were to say, because again, I'm just sort of taking a stab at it, and I think
Yeah,
I'm maybe
but-
accurate, but what I came up with was about $780 in income tax, which works out to about 2.5%, a little more than 2.5%.
Yeah, it depends on their
Does that
deductions
sound,
and their
sure,
exclusions,
sure.
yeah.
Does that sound in about the right range?
It could be, yeah. I mean, I
Okay,
don't
so
have
if we
the
took away the income tax for that family of four with $30,000, they would no longer pay the 2.5% income tax, but they might see a rise from 6% to say 7.5% or 8%. Again, the bill has 8% in it, but we're perfecting the process. So wouldn't they in effect receive a tax cut if we go to the sales tax and we cut the income tax down, the 2.5% on the family of four at $30,000?
We would have to run the numbers to say, I'm not.
Does that sound like it's out of line? They actually could probably see something of a tax decrease,
I'm
a
not
tax
sure.
cut?
I'm not sure about that. I have to run the numbers to see that.
Sure.
And ITAP's happy to do that. They're happy to come here and explain it too.
And so if we combined an EITC with the fact that they will no longer pay income tax, not only would they probably be tax neutral, a tax cut, they would actually probably get a significant tax cut and even some money back. And so for the poor of West Virginia, if we do include an EITC, this could very well be a boon of a tax bill, couldn't it?
It could help if let's see what size of the EITC that is. It's pretty big.
Sure, I mean, but if just the straight 2.5% comes off and 2% goes on, that's a net increase right there, and the EITC is just bonus money.
Yeah, I'd like to see the numbers first before.
Sure, sure.
Yeah.
And it's also true probably, and I'm sure you're aware of it because you're kind of into this, is if I take 2.5% off of my income, that's 2.5% off my income. But when I pay an additional 2% sales tax, that's usually on about 30 to 40% of my income, right? So the actual sales tax that I pay might really only represent about 0.5% of my income.
When we look at that chart too, it breaks it down exactly what percent of your income is paid in sales taxes versus income taxes. And you look at that middle 20%, that's basically roughly your middle class in West Virginia. They pay more in sales taxes than income taxes.
Sure.
So if you're increasing one and getting rid of the other, you're not going to get even.
Now, if I could shift gears just a little bit, again, I don't know how much of this you've looked at, and then I don't want to take up all the time because we do have another speaker and maybe some other folks will have questions too, but one of the reasons for taking this approach, I think, is because of the prosperity that I believe it would be almost certain to bring to West Virginia. And one of the ways we measure that would be what we call household income. Is that something you've ever really looked at very much?
Household income?
Yeah.
Yeah, we look at it every year.
Okay,
Especially
okay.
median
So
household.
if you look at the states that don't have an income tax today, do you know where their household income falls in relative to the average in the nation?
When I looked at median household income.
Median household
The
income.
high income states had the highest median household income. That's on, see that chart. I didn't look at average because we want to see how the middle class is.
No, the median is actually quite a good way to look at it. I agree with that.
we have it.
The numbers that I came up with from the Bureau of Labor Statistics says that the states that don't have an income tax have a household income, the median is 6% higher than the national average.
That's not what I have. I have that the higher income states, I'm just looking at that.
Could I ask where your numbers come from? Mine came from the BLS,
Yeah,
the Bureau of
that's-
Labor Statistics for 2015.
Well, the
And
BLS doesn't have, I don't use them for income yet. I use the ACS, the American Community Survey.
sure,
for median.
another alternative.
Yeah.
Okay.
CPS is really the current
And
population survey. You might-
Where does West Virginia rank right now in that?
Oh, we're way down the bottom, the
Okay.
49th, 50th.
Are you familiar with the states that don't have an income tax?
Yeah, we can go through those.
What's the lowest one?
On the median household income?
Yeah.
I have no idea. I didn't bring all the data with. I didn't bring
Is
that.
that-
I'm happy to
Yeah,
bring that
sure,
back and give it to
sure.
the committee.
Well, we'll talk
More
about
than
this
happy.
more, but I would throw out that what I have is Tennessee, and that Tennessee is 11% higher than West Virginia, so that the lowest
Yeah.
of the performing states with no income tax is 11% higher than West Virginia. And so
Yeah.
if we saw that kind of growth, we might see significant growth in West Virginia compared to Tennessee.
Well, I mean, I think you have to understand too that there's just correlation. If there's correlation, it's not causation. I mean, ice
That's true.
cream and shark attacks go up during the same time. They have nothing to do with each other other than summer.
That's true, and I don't see any other lights lit up. I always like that correlation isn't causation factor, but I think we can all agree that non-correlation or a lack of correlation is almost certainly a lack of causation.
That's why we use academics to try to tease those things out.
I appreciate you appearing here today.
I appreciate you having me.
I'm sure we're going to hear more from you as we go through this process. I do think that the discussion related to the EITC is sort of got some traction around the state.
Excellent.
We'll see how that goes. We do have one other person who's going to address the committee today, and so if I see no other questions from the committee, again, I'd like to say thank you, Mr. Bettner, and perhaps we can ask our next speaker to come forward and hear what he's got to say.
Thank you guys very much. Appreciate it.
Thanks. John, if you could state your name and who you're with, and we'd like to hear from you what you've got to offer on this.
Well, thank you so much for having me. You know that I've testified down here many times, and I always really enjoy it and really appreciate the invitation.
If you could...
for the record, my name's John Deskins. I serve as Assistant Dean for Outreach and Engagement and Director of the Bureau of Business and Economic Research, and as Associate Professor of Economics in the College of Business and Economics at WVU. Tax policy is actually my specialty. You guys know I'm something of a jack of all trades because I talk about a whole host of issues down here in the Capitol. But tax policy is my traditional area of focus. My dissertation was in tax policy. My PhD advisor was one of the foremost tax policy experts in the country in terms of state and local tax policy. I've published about 15 papers in professional economics journals altogether, and many of those have been in tax policy, been active with the National Tax Association. I won't bore you, but I'm happy to be here to talk taxes.
Thanks.
I thought I would start just by talking about the three fundamental principles of tax reform. They're straightforward, they're all very understandable, but I think it's nice to step back and think about those principles as we go through this process. The first, unsurprisingly, is simplicity. Lots of reasons to favor a more simple tax system. Academics sometimes think there's some inherent tendency for tax systems to become more and more complex over time. So we always have to keep in mind the importance of simplicity. So I'm not going to say too much about that, but that should be on the forefront of your minds as we go through the system, as we go through evaluating to find a better system. The next principle that is absolutely fundamental, of course, is efficiency. The idea here is that all taxes, or almost all taxes, are bad, right? We don't want to pay taxes. They're a necessary evil to fund things like roads and public education and police. But they're a necessary evil, they're bad, and they distort behavior, right? Taxes can distort behavior in a whole bunch of ways. You see a few questions I have here, for example. Where should I live? Tax policy can affect that decision. Should I work? How many hours should I work? Should I buy a home or should I rent? How much should I save? Get to that in just a second. Should I start a small business? Should I move an existing business? How much risk should I tolerate? All these are just a few examples of the kinds of questions or the kinds of decisions that tax policy can distort. So our goal in setting tax policy as efficiently as possible is to try to minimize these distortions. There's always going to be inefficiencies, there's always going to be negative consequences associated with taxes, but we're looking for ways to minimize those distortions. And the key point to take away from this context of efficiency is the notion of a broad tax base and a correspondingly lower tax rate. If you tax everything at a lower rate, that's more efficient than just taxing a few things, than leaving a lot of exemptions, deductions, and credits, and leaving a lot of holes in the base, not taxing those things. For example, if government just picks winners and losers, we're going to tax these items, we're not going to tax those items, that's inefficient, generally speaking. Just imagine if you tax apples at a 6% rate versus tax apples at a 6% rate, but you don't tax oranges. What's going to happen? You're going to see changes in consumption patterns, and those changes are not going to be good. It would be better to tax apples and oranges at a 3% rate rather than just apples at a 6% rate, no tax on oranges. You can see the parallel here. The parallel is with services. We have no good reason why we tax goods under the sales tax, but we don't tax services. There's no good reason, there's no theoretical reason for that. If I go in and buy a baseball, I pay taxes. I go get a haircut, I just got a haircut yesterday. Don't pay taxes on that. It doesn't make sense. It's inefficient. It leads to distortions that should not be there. Interesting example, I just did my taxes last weekend. Of course, I had to pull out some whiskey to get through that, the pain of paying those taxes, but I just did my taxes last weekend, but I used TurboTax. You actually pay taxes on TurboTax because it's a piece of software that you're buying. Pay taxes if you do TurboTax. If you hire an accountant to do your taxes, you don't have to pay a sales tax on that. Doesn't make any sense. There's no reason for that. It's inefficient. So the notion of broadening the base, in this particular case of broadening the sales tax base, or whatever tax base it is, a broader tax rate is going to be more efficient with correspondingly lower rates than a narrow base with a whole lot of carve-outs where government picks winners and losers that has to have a higher rate to yield the same amount of revenue. That's a key principle. I've long been an advocate of broadening the sales tax base to services to the extent possible to try to follow that key fundamental principle. And the third principle, of course, is fairness. That's probably the toughest principle because this principle depends on a lot of value judgments. It's much harder for a scientist to speak to this principle compared to the principles of simplicity and efficiency. But we have to make sure that a tax system is fair as well. We have this notion of horizontal equity, the notion that similar people should be treated in a similar way by the tax system. Most important one here today is probably the principle of vertical equity, the notion of how the tax burden changes as your income rises. Ted's already talked about this point a little bit, but of course a proportional system would be defined as a system where the average tax rate that you pay, your total tax bill divided by your income, that average tax rate is the same for everybody. Rich people pay more in taxes than poor people, but their rate is the taxes they pay as a share of income is the same. If that rate rises with income, we have a progressive system. If the rate falls with income, we have a regressive system. Now, I'm not going to say anything really about fairness because that's a value judgment. I'm a scientist. I'm not an advocate. I'm not here to speak to fairness issues. It's appropriate for Ted to speak to fairness issues because he has an advocacy role in his position, but I don't, and that's, of course, for you to decide as the people's elected representatives. It is true, though, that in general, and I'm not speaking about the EITC component in particular right yet, but in general, a consumption tax is going to be less progressive or more regressive than an income tax. The fact of the matter is higher income people save a lot more. Lower income people, a lot more of their income goes towards consumption. If you have a single mom who's making $15,000 a year with 2 kids, she's spending 100% of her income. Right? She's not saving anything. Rich person, $500,000 a year, they may be saving a huge percentage of their income. So if you have a consumption tax where you're just taxing consumption and not savings, it's going to be the fact of the matter that the average tax rate will fall as income rises. That's just the pattern that we see in the real world. But again, you can judge that yourself. But the one thing that you have to keep in mind in understanding this, though, is we want to analyze the tax system as a whole. Okay? It doesn't make any sense to analyze West Virginia's tax system in isolation because we're also working in conjunction with the federal tax system. And the fact of the matter is that the federal income tax, or the federal tax system overall, especially the federal PIT, is highly progressive. Right? The federal PIT, as Ted mentioned, about half of people don't pay any federal income taxes, and then the top rate rises all the way to 39% that you're paying on your last dollar of income for a very high income person. So the federal tax is very progressive. So it's do we want to have a system that's also progressive? If we have a system that's proportional, then the overall system will still be progressive. And we could even have a system that is to some degree regressive, and the system would still be overall progressive with the federal system. So the point of caution I'm making is you have to analyze the system as a whole, not the federal system in isolation, not the state system in isolation, but any questions of fairness should consider the progressivity that's already there in the federal system. So those are the 3 classic principles that should be guiding points behind any tax policy discussion. This notion of, what should our tax base be? Should we levy taxes based on income, or should we levy taxes based on consumption? This is really one of the most classic questions in tax policy. Right? I talked about the 3 classic guiding principles, but now this is one of the classic questions. Any undergraduate tax policy class is going to address this question. Certainly PhD level classes would too. It's a fundamental question. Of course, the issue is with savings, right? An income tax is your entire income. Whether you spend that money, whether you save that money, no matter what proportion goes to savings versus spending. Consumption tax only levied on the money that you spend. All the money that you save goes tax-free. It accumulates tax-free, in whatever financial investment you put that in until you pull the money out for savings, for spending at some point in the future. So here the question is savings. I quote Doug Holtz-Eakin here. Doug Holtz-Eakin is actually the PhD advisor of one of my key mentors. He's a well-known economist. He was director of the Congressional Budget Office. He's had a lot of accolades. I like this quote from him. Doug Holtz-Eakin, I heard him say this a few years ago at the National Tax Association or some meeting in Washington. He says a consumption tax, it's based on what you take from society. An income tax is based on what you put into society. Right? Your income is reflective of your work. If we tax income, the tax is based on what you're putting into society. It's based on your work. It's based on your income. It's based on what you provide. Consumption tax based on what you're spending, the resources that you're bringing out of society. And I thought that was a pretty interesting way to think about the debate of income taxation versus consumption taxation. But the idea here is that a consumption-based system, since savings goes tax-free, consumption-based system is going to work to incentivize savings. We all know that our savings rates are, I think, kind of abysmal if you look at the statistics, how little people save. But a consumption-based system, it's the idea. It encourages savings. I think overall, it will encourage savings, and I think it will have some positive effects in that way. But we have to be cautious here, though. If we move forward with a system that relies heavily on consumption taxation, that relies heavily on extending consumption taxes to services. I was asked this question just recently. The question was, why don't we tax services now? The answer is there is no theoretical reason. We should be taxing services. Any economist would agree with that. This is a very straightforward notion. We don't tax services simply because it's harder to. Especially historically, there's less of a paper trail. It's just harder to levy taxes on services and to monitor and enforce taxation of services. So we don't do it just simply because of difficulty, not because it's the right or wrong thing to do. That's the story. So what we're going to do is we're going to estimate how much additional revenue we're going to bring in by expanding the sales tax base to services. Professor Kent and I are working on that. I'm sure folks in the Revenue Department are working on that. But those estimates, we don't know how much evasion is going to occur as we extend sales taxes to services. So those estimates have to be interpreted conservatively, at least for the first year, right? Well, I would strongly argue for kind of a phase-in approach, a gradual approach to make sure that the revenues are what we think they are, and then move forward over the course of 2 or 3 years, because evasion could be much higher for taxation of services versus taxation of goods. I go to the hairdresser. I say, hey, here's $10 for my haircut. They could just take that money, put it in their pocket. There's no paper trail. There's nothing to follow. They could evade tax. That's what I'm talking about here. So evasion could be high. I think we should err on the side of caution, basically. It is true. Ted also mentioned this. I wanted to follow up on this. This is one point that I want to respond to you, Ted. You don't look like Ted. But no, not you. He's absent. I was going to follow up on one of Ted's points. He did say that the sales tax tends to grow more slowly over time. Fact of the matter is, as our economy has evolved, we spend more on services, less on goods. That's just the historical fact, looking back at our economy over the last 50 years or whatever. Spend more on services, less on goods. So as we grow, as we spend more and more on services, given the fact that almost every state sales tax system doesn't tax very many services, more and more of consumption is escaping the sales tax. So that's why the sales tax grows more slowly over time. But if our system actually is effective in taxing services, that issue isn't present. Does that make sense? That's an issue because they fail to tax services. But if we can tax services, that goes by the wayside. A few more principles. Another key principle of tax policy is that you need to levy a tax on a base that's immobile, right? There's going to be less of an inefficient distortion if you tax something that can't be moved versus something that can easily be moved. You know, the most classic example here is a land tax, okay? Just a tax on land, not necessarily a property tax, but just on the land component. Land is the most immobile base. A lot of people advocate land taxes because it can't be moved. There can be no distortion there. The reason I bring this up is for the inventory tax on business inventory, okay? How easy is it for a business to move its inventory from West Virginia to across the state line if we tax business inventory, but if our neighboring state doesn't? Business inventory tax is a tax that is on basically the most mobile base. It doesn't make sense. It might have some positives in other ways, but taxes are supposed to be levied on bases that are immobile. Business inventory is the complete opposite of that. And also, economists often advocate for benefits taxation. Ted mentioned, he made reference to the ability to pay principle, but the opposite principle there is the benefits principle, where the tax that you pay is directly tied to the benefit that you receive. Economists also believe that if you rely on benefits taxation, that's not going to be as inefficient as other forms of taxation. The reason I bring this up is the gasoline excise tax. If we pay tax on gasoline, that's a pretty good proxy of how much we're using the road. If we take that revenue and use it for road maintenance, you know, it's a pretty good way of taxing. So just keep that in mind as you go forward. Benefits taxation, we want to rely on taxes where the benefits are tied to the tax as much as possible. I just want to talk about the PIT real quickly. We have a system in place in my office in the BBER where we can really analyze the PIT with a lot of detail. So, you know, as you go through this process, if we decide that we want to expand the sales tax base to these services but not medical services, for example, or if we want to expand the sales tax base and raise the sales tax rate by 1 point, or whatever scenario you come up with, we can look at the revenue projections on that side of the coin, and we can go back to the personal income tax and estimate how much we can lower the personal income tax rate to yield overall revenue neutrality in the system. What you see up here is some work that we did for the Joint Committee on Tax Reform last year. What we did here is I kind of lay out for you the current system, and then we look at kind of what would the rate be if we had a single rate for revenue neutrality. If we wanted to come up with a system that had just a little bit of graduation in the rate structure, what could that look like to yield revenue neutrality? If we wanted a system that has even a more graduated structure than what we have now, what would that look like? That's structure 3. So you don't have to pay a whole lot of attention to these numbers, but what I'm saying is when we get to this stage of the game, we can work for you to provide you a whole lot of analysis of how we could restructure the PIT to follow any consumption taxation changes that you want. If you decide not to completely get rid of the PIT, I mean, if you make that decision, then this is all moot. But if you want to keep the PIT in a reduced form, we can help you with that analysis. In that analysis, we can look at how the average tax rate paid would change across different income groups. And here's an example of tax incidence. How much of the overall tax is paid by, actually this is an interesting slide, right? The yellow portion here tells you how much of the overall taxes are paid by the richest 20% of households. The blue portion tells you what percentage of taxes are paid by the second richest 20% of households, and so on. Now, this is just under the PIT right here, but we could provide you this incidence analysis under whatever scenario you would like. Again, I'm not going to comment on that because I don't comment on value judgments, but we can provide you with the information, and then you can make the value judgments. Happy to be here. Do you have any questions at all?
Thank you, John. Do we have any questions for our speaker? The senator from Nicholas.
John, good to see you. Thanks for coming down.
Great to see you.
You picked a great day to drive, I think.
After all this rain, believe me, I'm glad to see some good
I'm
stuff.
sure. When we get to looking at our tax plan, our tax program, going back to the Constitution, the way West Virginia's Constitution is structured, when I look at taxation and finances as stipulated in Article 10 of the Constitution, it says, the very first line says, subject to the exceptions in this section contained, taxation shall be equal and uniform throughout the state. The description that you gave us with regard to simplicity, fairness, and efficiency sort of address that line of our Constitution in concept, doesn't it?
I mean, I'm not that familiar with the Constitution. I'm embarrassed to say I wish I had one of my law school friends here, but it seems to match. It seems like they're both based on good common sense and good sound principles.
So it would only make reason then that we would begin looking at new approaches that we typically do taxation to make it so that we continue to capture the revenue that's necessary for the state, but do it in a fashion that promotes fairness, but more importantly, provides opportunities for people to either spend and tax for their consumption, or in the alternative, encourages savings, which, I mean, as I talked with Mr. Bettner a few minutes ago, we've become a spending society. My parents and the older generations were people who put lots of money in the bank, and if not in the bank, in the mattress. Am I correct in that?
I was practically raised by my grandpa. I lived right next door to my grandpa, an old coal miner, Depression era. I would love to have data on what his savings rate was. I bet it would have been astronomical. What share of his income he saved. Compare that to the young people of today, how they save zero or they go into debt. It's quite a contrast.
Okay. Thanks. I appreciate your comments.
Any other questions?
Thank you, Senator. Do we have any other questions for our guest? I'll just, a couple of questions I have myself. One is really relates to what the Senator from Nicholas was talking about there. Essentially, consumption taxation puts the choice in the hands of the taxpayer. And so that's sort of where we come up with this notion that a consumption tax versus an income tax, because on an income tax, you don't have a choice. You pay the tax right up front, right off the top. So when we offer a consumption tax option instead, that equals choice.
Well, I mean, the way I put it is an income tax gives you no bonus for savings. It gives you no bonus, it gives you no incentive to save money. Consumption tax, that's its fundamental difference. It does give you a choice. If you take your income, if you save a good chunk of it, then you get a perk from the tax system for doing that.
It's like the state is investing some part of your former income tax perhaps into your savings plan instead.
Yeah. And you'll save, and then that will be, can I comment on one other point?
Sure.
What Ted mentioned, it is an interesting point that if we all of a sudden increase their savings today, that will hurt the economy in the immediate term. If everybody just starts saving money, there is less demand in the immediate term. This is what economists call the paradox of savings. I teach this actually in my very sophomore class, because savings is fundamental in the long run, right? Savings and therefore capital investment is of absolutely fundamental importance to economic development in the long run. But if we all of a sudden start increasing our savings, that will hurt demand in the economy in the short run. So he brought up that point, and it's a very interesting point because it's a paradox. But I don't know if that was related to your question or not, but all of a sudden I thought of it. But the savings benefits the economy in the long run, even though there may be some rockiness.
Sure, I mean, if I understand correct, what we're saying is, yeah, you don't spend the money right now, but because you're saving and, quote, investing, that we're a capitalist society, that money's going to go somewhere to improve some process or develop some business or et cetera. So the investment pays dividends, as we all know, but not necessarily in the immediate term. I see a light on from Senator from Wayne.
No, actually, I just wanted to make sure that we had a copy of the other presentation, hard copy, make sure that we get this one as well.
You should be able to email it to you. Or I can email it to you, it doesn't matter.
Well, if you email something, I'd like for you to email everybody, if you would, please.
Should I just email it to,
Actually,
George, just email it to the senator and have him.
we can make sure that everybody on the committee gets a
Well,
copy of the slides.
It's right here. I'll give it to Jordan as soon as we leave here. But also, just call me anytime, and I'd be happy to talk to you anytime.
Another just general question, because we're too early in the bill. I know you've probably had a chance to maybe glance at it, and we've had a little bit of discussion, related to it. But this question raised by Ted, would you agree that it's essentially a totally mixed bag, or are the states that don't have an income tax generally doing much better than?
Well, I think you can't just look at whether they have an income tax or not, because there are so many factors at play. But in general, economists believe that taxes do matter. There is a lot of research out there, and there's a lot of inconsistencies in the research because, well, I won't go into that, but there's a whole lot of different dimensions that can affect the nature of the study, and and some studies are better than other studies as well. It's not as though each study is equal weighted. But in general, taxes matter, and positive tax reform can yield positive benefits, and it will likely yield positive benefits. That's the consensus of the literature. But I will say, though, I will say usually the benefits are there, they're real, but they're usually not game changers, right? We still have to worry about the other problems we have to address in West Virginia, like our infrastructure challenges, for example. But the literature believes that positive tax reform yields positive change.
Okay, Senator from Wayne.
Yes, you've actually started bringing up the points that really need to be made. Growth is just, or no income tax is not only one factor. I've got a list here that I've been looking up to probably 10 or 12 that really need to be looked at. So when we're looking at this, you brought up infrastructure, and I think that's a really valid area to look at. So I would like to make sure that when you do review these things, we look at it just not specifically maybe to a question you've been asked, but to the holistic idea if we're truly going to try to get to where we are making a sort of a fair tax as well. We look at where our deficiencies are right now.
My comments today were mostly around, for a given amount of revenue, what's the best way to raise that amount of revenue? So I haven't really commented on the size of government, but I've said many times that I do not envy your job. I don't want your job, because it's a tough job, because there is so much to weigh with tax policy, with infrastructure, with drug abuse. It's a tough job, and we definitely have to analyze it holistically, and I'll always provide my advice as best as I can. But
well, you got human capital, got physical capital, labor force participation, industry and occupation mix, income and transfer payments, population size and migration, geographic consumption patterns. You can go on. I've done this a little bit myself, so you've got a number of things that we need to be looking at.
And it all needs to be addressed holistically, which is the tough part.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Senator. I see no other lights on my board here.
Great.
Thank you, John.
Thank you again. Glad to be here.
So that's our presentation for today. Again, we don't actually have any bills that we're putting before the committee, and so I will ask the senator. First, I'll ask if there is any other business that members have to bring to the committee, and hearing none, I'll ask the senator from Ohio for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move we adjourn.
Questions on adjournment? All those in favor?
Aye.
We're adjourned.
Happy weekend.
Same to you.